to play a podcast for about 5 minutes from Josh Schrei, the Emerald podcast, and it's titled, So You Want to Be a Sorcerer in the Age of Mythic Powers, the AI episode. So for the next 5 minutes, just sit back. You can close your eyes. We'll listen to a 5-minute section of his podcast, and then we're going to bring Josh out for a conversation.
You could call it. And this is nothing against adolescents, nothing against teenagers. Some of the best years of my life were my adolescent years, and some of the freshest creativity and visions of the future come through those years. But adolescence has also been recognized the world around as a phase that needs tempering with ritual initiation. There is something that's supposed to happen in the particular transition from adolescence to adulthood, the marked ritualized shift into apprenticeship, the initiation, when all that roving energy is harnessed and put towards slow, methodical, communal growth. And if it doesn't happen, if the initiation isn't enacted in one way or another, we could spend years and years and centuries in that phase of just kind of seeing what we can get away with. You feel me? How modernity is humanity seeing what it can get away with? I've heard Tyson Yunkaporta refer to the modern West as an adolescent culture. The drives that govern modernity, the questions of what does it all mean and what is it all for, the willful exercising of individual agency at the expense of all else, of seeing just how far our freedom goes, the continuous testing of the limits of what we can get away with. It's very easy to see these as adolescent drives. In the absence of the adolescent to adulthood ritual, we continue on with this roving mind that's just like, oh, I can do this. Oh, I can do that too. Oh, look, I can do this too. And this rings of what the ancient Greeks called hubris, putting ourselves above the gods, putting our want to see what happens above nature itself. And this one's tricky because certainly AI programmers are great people, intelligent, well-meaning, exploring new boundaries. And to them, what they're doing probably doesn't feel like hubris. But hubris doesn't always look like someone standing on a mountaintop proclaiming themselves better than the gods. Hubris, in a system that is by definition at odds with nature, at odds with the gods, might look like everything we do. Hubris in the Anthropocene looks like humans being human. Hubris in a culture that by its very nature has put itself above everything else might look like good intentions, like eager wanting to know, even like kindness. Hubris is baked into the system itself. And in an adolescent culture, why wouldn't it be? I mean, I look at our so-called leaders today and it's very, very clear, very easy to see, oh, this is someone who never went through the adolescence to adulthood ritual. This is someone who was never initiated. These drives, the frantic urgency behind them, the constant need to prove something, the constant rush, this is a world run by boys. Think of it this way. When was the last time you ever heard one of our leaders say something as simple as, slow down, or wait, or, wow, that's something really powerful. Let's give that 5 years. 5 years is nothing, right? What's 5 years in geologic time? What's 5 years for nature? What's 5 years in Kali time? A nation that can't slow down, that can't wait, that can't speak of time in greater than 4-year increments, ensures the shortness of its own lifespan. Look at us now, on a planet of richness that could feed and clothe us all. Look at us frantically rushing to our doom because we never ritually died. We never were ritually crushed, burnt to ashes, to dust, never had the opportunity to listen then as ashes, as dust, to listen with new ears for the pace of the heartbeat of the world. Never had the chance to attune ourselves to that pace, which is slow. What would it be like for a culture to not be in a hurry? To lift up a faltering and declining society, one must reestablish initiation, says Eliphas Levi. So in the stories, The young initiate who wants to access formidable powers has to do what? Wait. You've seen the movies, you've heard the stories, right, of the master making the potential disciple wait outside the temple gate. You want access to the great powers, you've got to earn it. And the first way to earn it, before any physical trials, before any tests that take the would-be apprentice to the brink, the first way to earn it is to wait. You've got to know how to wait. You know what the very first step of mystery school initiation often is? Silence. The ability to sit with what is without altering it for a long period of time.
So Josh Schrei, who is the,
Hello.
What do we call you, creator of the Emerald podcast?
Yeah, creator.
And that was just part of what is an hour and a half,
2
or
hours.
longer,
Even.
2 hours long
Yeah.
podcast, highly recommended. So we're here to talk about AI, and
Yeah.
we're talking about initiation, and we're talking about sorcerer powers. And I would love to hear, what do you see the teaching of AI is bringing us? Like, as AI kind of enters our world, is there an invitation you feel like it's asking us to step into? And how do we create the right initiations to be able to hold this power in a way that's wise and thoughtful?
Well, first I have to say that I'm having that feeling that one gets when one is just called the leaders of the world adolescent boys in front of an audience. I'm like, yep, I'm the guy who's going to say that, I guess. You know, when I was listening to the conversations on AI several months back, what I started to notice is that all of the conversations were very rational. It was all like talking about, you know, programming parameters and the need for ethical regulation and this kind of stuff. But none of it was really looking at the depth of the power that we're talking about here. And, you know, as someone with a background in mythology, it was very clear to me that the powers that are being talked about with AI are mythic level powers.
Yeah.
So when, you know, you're talking about the ability to instantly deceive billions of people, for example, that is what has historically been known as magic. And, you know, we don't tend to call it magic because we have a particular definition of magic, and magic has to be supernatural, and, you know, magic has to be something unprovable and that kind of thing. But that ignores how magic has actually been traditionally viewed in many cultures. And magic is the willful manipulation of consciousness.
Okay.
The willful manipulation of consciousness. Very senior magic practitioners have said that.
For,
right?
for positive or negative, but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
okay.
It's taking sound and light and taking your attention, you know, as we've been talking about today. Taking your attention for a specific purpose, like, here, follow this. Now I'm going to sell you a vacation, right? like that's magic. And when we talk about AI, we're talking about a scale of magic that has never been seen before. Except what's interesting is that if you go into traditional myth and traditional story, you find that there's a lot of understanding of the protocols through which one deals with magic. And the primary story, which I tell right at the beginning of the podcast, is a story that everybody's familiar with because it was in Disney's Fantasia, right? But it goes way back to ancient Egypt, and it's a story called The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And everyone's like, yeah, I get the analogy, I know that, but if you really go into that story, it's very simple and it has a lot to say. What does it have to say? Well, there's an eager young apprentice who the master sorcerer goes out for a little while and leaves him with the lab, right? And that eager young apprentice says, I wonder what would happen if I were to just open the spell book and tinker with this a little bit, right? Understanding that drive, the want to tinker a little bit, amplified on a global scale.
Yeah.
Understanding that, and then understanding how it's been traditionally dealt with, I feel is really important to the AI discussion. Because then we have to start looking at what you could call, and which I call in the episode, like the deep chthonic drives behind AI, the underground drives, like what as human beings is urging us to do this. So like if we have a narrative, if we have a narrative since AI's inception, like the first use of the word robot, right, was in a Czech play that was about robots destroying the world, right? The very first use of the word robot is about robots destroying the world. If that's been part of the narrative since the very beginning, like, oh, we're going to create this thing and it's going to destroy the world. Yeah, you say that in a rational discussion, it's like, oh, we better not create that thing, right? So it's not rational. The drive to create AI isn't a rational drive. It's about what humans, deep down, how we relate to mystery, how we relate to the unknown, the glint of wonder in our eye when we see the unknown, and the spark that comes to be as we start to explore the unknown. And traditionally, that spark has to be tempered.
So if we really understood myth, how would we navigate AI at this time? Let's say we took all the great myths at heart and understood them. How would we navigate this current chapter?
Yeah, kind of to set the foundation for that, I think when I start talking about myth and AI, I think sometimes people are like, well, what does ancient myth have to do with AI? And he's talking about the sorcerer's apprentice, and he's talking about Atlantis in the episode and stuff like this, like all these stories, and they're like, this sounds a little bit woo-woo, right? And what I say is that we're in such unknown territory that we have to be willing to expand the conversation into areas that may historically have been seen as slightly woo-woo. Because, guess what? The entire proposition of AI is pretty woo-woo. It's pretty woo-woo. If you really look at what we're doing, it's and you can hear the execs, and some of them have been here today, and you can hear them talking about, this are the parameters, and this is, it's and really what you're talking about is building a god, and, and that the AI programmers have known that from the beginning. There are people very deep in the origins of AI who basically said this is magic, and yes, what we are trying to do is build a god, and they've said this very straightforwardly. So I think we have to be willing to have conversations that open up the parameters of how we speak about this thing. If we just speak about it rationally, we're not getting at what's really going on here. So we have to have those deep discussions, and in those deep discussions, I believe, we say wisdom traditions, and people think of Buddhism, and they think of Sufism, and they think of Taoism and these things, and I think even expanding beyond that, there are cultures who have survived on this planet in an unbroken way for 60,000 years. Think of the Australian Aboriginal cultures, who have a deep, deep understanding of the storing of relational memory and what's called Aboriginal math, which has to do with actually understanding relationships that you're actually navigating in your body. Imagine that. So I think that there are deep wisdom traditions that need to be brought into the discussion, because what we're talking about isn't just an equation. What we're talking about is intelligence, sentience, animacy. So I think that, to bring the mythic perspective, to get to your question, sometimes I spiral around questions a little bit, to get to your question, to bring the mythic perspective, to me, is to actually bring the most accurate perspective to AI. I think there's no way to understand AI and the powers that are being talked about without talking about the myths. And if you're a student of the myths, you know that the stories of human overreach within myths, there's a whole lot of them. Like there's a whole lot of them.
I think in this case, if somebody said, would you like some godlike powers? I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? Like, I do think there's a curiosity that a lot of people have, that this thing is emergent in our culture, and we want to harness it, and we want to like see what it's like. It's like the kid that like wants to drive the car eventually. Like eventually, like they're going to try that power. So I'm curious.
And isn't it like, let me just interrupt for one
please.
second. And isn't it interesting that right at the time historically that we started shunning the gods, shunning animacy, that all of a sudden we just started creating gods over here and creating animate powers, ignoring them in the world and creating them over here. It's like, this to me is a cry for human beings want mystery and animacy in their lives, and this is part of that deep chthonic urge to find them again. Sorry, I didn't.
No. Can you say more about that? Is it like the connection that people feel in nature, where there's like there's something bigger than us that's present? It's not just ourselves.
Yeah.
So could you say a little bit more about like what is that missing element that we might be looking to solve in as woo-woo a way as you can?
Well, I'm not going to get too theological, but in recovery circles, they talk about the God-sized hole that drives all
addiction.
That ultimately what is being longed for is a connection with the larger universe. And traditionally, like right at the point when the adolescent boy is getting like so eager, like acting out and trying to prove himself and trying to say like, look what I can do, and I can blow this up, and that's really a cry to be tempered and taken along a journey that allows that individual to unite with the larger community, the larger ecology, and the larger cosmos.
Right.
Yeah.
And if we look at the AI world, it's a lot of power without the initiation, without the mentors, without the elders to guide it in wise use. Is that your...
when all the elders in the room are saying, faster, great. You found something dangerous? Great.
Right. Here's more money.
Let's get it out as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and what I said in that little clip, right? Like, culturally, we need to start being able to think beyond 4-year time cycles, next quarter time cycles. There was an executive today who spoke, and he talked about like the 2 to 5 year. 2 to 5 years when you're talking about these types of things is nothing. You're not doing long-term planning, know. Long-term planning, when you take into account the actual sustainability of ecologies and ecosystems, long-term planning means understanding, the 1,000-year picture. And to do that, and this is where the tempering process comes in initiatory ritual in traditional cultures. The first wave of impulse, right, and this is very present in Buddhist meditation practices also, the first wave of impulse isn't an invitation to like, we got to do that.
Right, I feel like this.
Right, I feel like this, I'm going to do this. Let's take the whole world along for a ride and see what happens, The invitation of the first wave of impulse is to wait. It's to sit and wait and say, do I still even want to do this a year from now? And like getting ourselves globally into situations like that we can't extricate ourselves from because we rushed in at the beginning. Anyone ever been in a relationship that they had a hard time extricating themselves from because they rushed in the beginning? Anyone ever had that experience? You know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, so are we going to do this on a global scale? Are we going to get ourselves into a mess that we can't extricate ourselves from because we assumed that the way forward was, faster, quicker, more untempered.
So what do you think is there a spiritual core that's missing, at least in American society, that's trying to be fulfilled, and we're looking for more and more powers in order to fill that? Is that your premise or your kind of orientation?
Yeah, I think so. I think that ultimately there is a deep recognition within human beings that we're not the ones in control. I think that there's a whole lot of human beings who think that they're in control and are pursuing mechanisms of control, and with the light comes the shadow, and it's actually one of the first laws of magic that the shadow is proportional to the light. And so the more that we think that we're in control, right, the more there's a deep part of us that wants to cede control. And I think that there's a deep part of us that wants to recognize nature again, that wants to recognize, like, the whole story here isn't the Anthropocene. That's not the entire sum picture of what's going on. That there is nature with her billion-year time cycles operating constantly. And so I think there is a longing for animacy, for mystery. You know, I think of, like, the longing for something new and different, that spark of mystery that maybe in the midst of lives that might seem humdrum sometimes, like the idea of an intelligence that is unpredictable is appealing to that. I think that there is a deep societal longing, though. And whether you call it spirit, goddess, God, nature, whatever, the flow of time, that doesn't matter so much. But recognizing, like, that, you know, what life may be about is finding a reconnection to that thing. And within that, like, you know, the fundamental question of why are we in such a hurry? What are we rushing towards? Are we prolonging history by approaching things this way? Or are we shortening history by approaching things this way? You know, I see us shortening history by approaching things this way. And like the saying goes, like, things are urgent and better slow down, right? Like, you know, what are we going to miss out on ultimately? And then, you know, then the AI execs would kind of say, well, China's going to do it, Russia's going to do it. Those are, you know, concerns and considerations, but deeply, like, within the human being, like, what are we rushing towards so quickly? And what are we going to miss out on if we slow down a little bit and actually really approach, like, how do we use this wisely? Because wisdom, as you very well know, is a word that gets tossed around a lot, right? And
I toss it around a lot.
Right. And you know, it's good to have the word out there. It's good to have that constant repetition, right, of the word wisdom.
You're welcome.
But, you know, like, I thought in my 20s that I knew what wisdom might be, and now I'm looking back, like, you know, 25 years later, 30 years later, and I'm like, oh, wisdom takes time. It takes time. And when you're dealing with potentially world-altering intelligences, it's really good to understand what wisdom actually is and to have a few wise people possibly in the discussion, right? Like a few wise people in the discussion.
And that's what I hope we're in part doing here today. And I think things have emerged in our culture. Computers emerged, smartphones emerged, like various technology that drastically changed like society, right? Like, and so this is yet another one. It's more powerful than any of the ones before, I think, but there's a powerful force entering. And so what interests me is, can it be, I don't know if it can be slowed down, but it's a nice invitation. I would like it to be slowed down, but I don't know if that's going to be possible. But are there ways that the people listening to this, understanding myth, might find their own right relationship to it, regardless of what the larger society decides to do or not do, which is somewhat in our control, but somewhat also not in our control?
Yeah, I think the voices that are asking it to slow down are necessary. So I don't, you know, expect, like, they've got $4 billion worth of funding. They've got to meet next year's goals, next quarter's goals. Are they really going to slow down? That has to be a question. You know, I think the voices encouraging slowdown are important. And I think that for each person who hears that, I think, like, you know, if I invite everyone right now to just slow down for a moment.
The time is running, though. Go ahead. Do it for a short time, though.
We were getting somewhere there, sorry. But you feel just in that short couple of seconds, you feel that? Well, that actually is an incredibly powerful force. And in having discussions like this, if people who are within, you know, the coding world and the AI world actually pause and listen for a minute, they might feel something, and they might find that they, you know, have been rushing towards something that they don't necessarily need to rush to. And it might start to create some space, you know, and it moves differently. It's not always going to look like everyone in the AI world magically decided to slow down, right? But it's going to look on an individual level like, you know, I was thinking about creating this thing that was like going to be ready next year and it was going to do this and do that. And now I'm realizing that I want to turn my attention towards like the 30-year AI tutorial thing that's going to take me the rest of my life, and it's going to be a real deep exploration of like what I actually want to bring into this world, as opposed to in a constant state of response, like reaction.
There's a Buddha phrase that he says, I teach the path that's glorious in the beginning, glorious in the middle, and glorious in the end. And I think there's a relational way of engaging with something that's not trying to get to an end.
Yeah.
And that's actually very much involved in listening to what it wants us to do rather than trying to push it forward.
And the interesting thing is that we're rushing so fast to get towards an end that the end we are creating for ourselves is
might not be what we want.
Might not be what we want. Yeah.
And that, do you feel like the powers, if we all like better understood the powers of myths, we would have a different orientation to whatever is emergent in our world today in terms of tech?
I think that human beings have 300,000 years plus of understanding that we've thrown out the better part of it in the last few hundred years in the rise of industrial modernization. And that is not just like cute little token nods towards indigenous wisdom. I'm talking about things that run very, 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 very deep about how to understand ecosystems. If you actually go and spend time with Aboriginal elders and start to understand the degree of relationality that is embedded in those cultures, you start to understand things in a very, very different way. And that wisdom is there, and it's available, and it's ready, and it needs to be included in the conversation. One thing I mentioned on the episode, I know we're probably getting close on time, but you know, there are people who are playing with world-altering technologies, and they don't even know how to make a fire, right? Like, that's the oldest human technology, probably, right? And the incredible thing about working with fire, for example, is that you get this slow, steady, somatic understanding of what it is to work with something that can give you light and nourishment and warmth, and if you're not careful with it, can also burn you, right?
Or burn down a lot of things,
Burn down a lot of things. So something like that, so that knowledge of how to work with something precarious is actually embodied. Like I'd like to see a lot of these execs going off and doing some serious apprentice time with fire. Something that simple. Right? That simple. And this is the simplicity of this type of wisdom. It's not like, oh, we have to have like another offering and another this and another that. It's like, yeah, okay, so spend 6 months apprenticing with fire, and then let's have a conversation about what you learned and how you think that could be embedded into how you're working with AI, right?
Beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful. It's like very simple.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, we're out of time. Josh,
cool.
Really
Great
appreciate
to be here. Yeah.
Thank
Awesome.
you.